Before we get started, please go over to Amazon.com and grab a copy of my book, Education and Justice. If you have an African-American son in public school, you need this book because I teach you the many ways that public schools mistreat African-American boys and what you can do to help your son. So go over there and get your copy immediately. I've been fighting for reparations for decades. In fact, I just re-aired a video that I did last year where I laid out an ironclad legal, moral, and biblical basis for reparations. But the truth of the matter is, blacks collectively are not serious about getting reparations. Because any black who claims to be for reparations, who also doesn't vote or does anything to help Trump, to help MAGA, to help the GOP win elections, listen to me carefully, is a bold-faced liar. I'm going to say that again. Any black who claims to be for reparations, who doesn't vote, or does anything to help Trump, MAGA, and the GOP win elections is a bold-faced liar. And I'm going to prove it in this video. So let me start by reading a comment from a commenter. And I'm telling you, it is one of the most foolish comments I've read concerning reparations in a long time. I started seeing this sort of thinking last year when I started doing YouTube videos. Well, here it is. I want you to read this with me, and I'm going to show you how foolish and asinine this comment is for someone to ever make regarding reparations. All right, let's go to the comment. All right, here's what it says. Mr. Corbett, vote the couch? An interesting concept. As a foundational Black American, I have been advocating for reparations. Good sir. Neither the Democrats nor the Republicans wanted to give me reparations. Now I believe in a quid pro quo. If you give me my reparations, I will give you my vote. Is that fair, good sir? Guess what happens if I don't receive my request? They won't receive my vote. I won't vote. I didn't vote. I don't call it vote the couch. I call it a silent protest. Now, when I read this, I thought to myself, this must be a bot. Because this is so completely, utterly foolish that a thinking human being will not come to this conclusion unless they have been the victim of disinformation. And that is very, very, very possible. So what I want to do is show you how foolish this comment really is. All right? And I'm not saying this to be disrespectful. But if we don't start calling this foolish thinking out, we're going to stay stuck forever. All right? So, let's deal with it. What you just heard, what you just read, is not strategy. Again, it's foolishness. It seems to be based on Dr. Claude Anderson's book, where he talked about quid pro quo. But Dr. Claude Anderson came out later and literally said that black folks now must vote. He said it on the Breakfast Club. So he disavowed his earlier advice not to vote if you don't get something. So people like this commenter, they say they want reparations, But by not voting, they help elect the very people who not only will not give reparations, but won't even allow a study to occur. So that's not protesting. That's participation in your own oppression. That's participation in your own injustice. You see, this kind of thinking is why this video is literally titled, "Blacks Are Not Serious About Reparations." Because we're not. We want something that takes serious power, but we refuse to use the one tool that gives us leverage, and that's our vote. So I'll say it plainly. Grow up, show up, or shut up about reparations. What we're not going to keep doing is shouting reparations on social media and then disappearing when it's time to vote, when midterms come around, when the general election come around and millions of us vote the couch, or even worse, like this past election, over 2 million of us vote for white supremacists who will never support reparations. And then we turn around and blame everyone but ourselves for our political weakness. That's what that is. And that's why I keep telling you, it does not matter that 92% of black women and 80-something% of black men who voted for Kamala when millions stayed home and didn't vote. Now, let me prove to you why we're being ignored, why our demand for reparations is so weak, and how we can change it. In 1989, the late Representative John Conyers introduced H.R. 40. The bill was just to create a commission to study reparations, not to pay reparations, just to study reparations. He was being a realist. He knew with whites, the kind of which a lot of black people are now supporting, in the government, in Congress, he knew he couldn't just say, I want reparations or we want reparations, because it would have been rejected. So he was doing the wise thing of simply requesting a study. Now, I have heard people downplay a study, and that's because they are not very knowledgeable about how to deal with the government, about how to deal with courts, about how to prove your case. They're not knowledgeable about that, so they downplay a study. I've heard it. But a study on reparations by the federal government would serve at least 3 essential purposes. So first, it would build a public record, and it would build political support. Take, for example, the 1990 Civil Liberties Act, which paid Japanese Americans $20,000 each for the World War II internment. Congress first formed a commission in 1980, held hearings, and built public consensus. In other words, they did a study before they could enact the compensation. Congress had to get the public on board. So they did precisely what Representative Conyers was attempting to do by introducing H.R. 40 to get the study done. You see, when we, for example, practice law, one of the things that we do during trial and pre-litigation is we build a record. We build a record so that if we need to appeal this, if we need to convince someone outside of the jury or the judge, we got a record that we can use. So the first reason a study is important of reparations is to develop a record. Second, a study would define the injuries and the class of eligible recipients. That's really important. When you're trying to get compensation, after you've suffered harm from a negligent person or from someone who has intentionally harmed you, you got to define that injury. And you got to define who is entitled to receive compensation from that or those injuries. So a study helps do that. You see, this is how you do things when you're dealing with the government, when you're dealing with courts. It clarifies everything, makes it easy, makes your case compelling when you can show and document what harms have been suffered and how to repair those harms. What types of reparations should we get? When you've done that kind of legwork up front from a study, then that makes things just that better. Third, a study helps survive the legal challenges. There have been many reparation cases filed in federal court, but they've all gotten shot down. Oftentimes, people just simply don't have the information that they need to get past base one, first base. We litigate federal cases all the time, and when you file those, the first thing the defendant is going to do in a federal case is file what we call a 12B6 motion and ask the judge to throw your case out before it even sees the light of day. But if you got a study, if you got the information that you can put in that complaint, then you're more apt to get past first base. And not only that, courts heavily, strictly scrutinize race-based legislation. So if Congress saw fit to recommend reparations, it would result in a lawsuit. It then would go to federal courts. And when they see that it is reparations based on race, they're going to strictly scrutinize it. And let's be honest, they're going to strictly scrutinize it even more so just because it involves black people. That is a legal doctrine, the strict scrutiny doctrine. And it requires that a state or federal government show that there's a compelling interest and that the legislation is narrowly tailored to achieve that compelling federal or state interest. Well, with the record, that helps a lot, right? A detailed public record from the study. It shows the courts, it shows Congress, it shows the public specific measurable harms and injuries and ways to repair those harms. So don't play down a study. I've heard people say, oh, that's just a study. We don't want no more studies. There's never been a study, to my knowledge, regarding reparations. The closest thing that we've had was the Kerner Commission report. After the LA riots, Lyndon Johnson commissioned a group of folks to study the riots, and they sort of touched on slavery some and so forth. but it wasn't a true reparations study. Nevertheless, they came back with recommendations to spend a lot of money to repair the damage that has been done to the African American community. And back then, white conservatives didn't want the Kerner Commission to study even the effects of the LA riots. So they don't want a commission to study reparations. And sadly and unfortunately, many blacks jump on the white conservative bandwagon and they start repeating white conservative talking points. So don't be one of those blacks. Don't disrespect the need for a study. Okay? So for those three reasons, at least those three reasons, Democrats have wisely reintroduced H.R. 40 to every Congress since 1989. Again, the late Representative John Conyers. He did so for decades faithfully. And then when he passed, the late Representative Sheila Jackson Lee out of Houston, she did the same thing. She took up the mantle. And then here, most recently, Representative Ayanna Pressley. And she caught flack, just people criticizing the Democrats anytime they try to do something to help African Americans. But the study is important for the reasons that I gave you. Now, it has never passed both chambers for one reason, because the GOP unanimously opposes it. I want you to see me say that again. The GOP has unanimously opposed H.R. 40 for decades. The GOP. The Democrats introduce it. The GOP unanimously opposes it. So when you that comment that we just read, in fact, let me pull it up again. It says, I have been advocating for reparations, good sir. Neither the Democrats nor the Republicans wanted to give me reparations. How can he say that with a straight face when it has been African American members of the Democratic Party introducing legislation for reparations for decades? And the GOP has been the one, or the group, the party, opposing it. So neither the Democrats nor the Republicans wanted to give me reparations is a lie. It's not factual. It is disinformation. Yet, African Americans believe this mess without doing their own research. But in 2021, after black voters showed up in 2020, H.R. 40 passed the committee for the first time in U.S. history. And that was because, again, a good number of African Americans went to the polls and voted in Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. So H.R. 40 passed the committee for the first time in U.S. history. Okay? Why? Because we showed up. We showed up that time. We gave the Democrats the power they needed to push H.R. 40. But then, guess what happened? We got quiet again. Turnout dropped for the midterm. And so then the bill stalled in Congress once again. You see? We cannot expect to get what we want politically if we don't show up, if we employ the thinking that this guy is talking about, or this bot, whoever this is. If you give me reparations, I will give you my vote. It's actually the other way around. You vote to get reparations. Okay? So again, the fact of the matter is, every sponsor and co-sponsor of H.R. 40 to just simply get a study done has been from the Democratic Party. And every opposition vote has been the Republican Party. In 2021, if memory serves me correctly, I think that it passed that committee based on about 25 Democratic votes and I think maybe 17 or 18 Republicans voted no. Yet some of you say both parties don't care about us and reparations. That is just a lie, and it's laziness, because you can look this stuff up. If we want reparations or anything else, we must supply the votes to the party that's most aligned with our fight for reparations, equality, the civil rights bill, whatever it is we're trying to get done. Because the other party doesn't care if we live or die. And they make that clear and have been making that clear for hundreds of years. And that includes factoring in the Southern strategy. Because, yes, of course, the Democrats back during slavery and Jim Crow, the Democratic Party was filled with Dixiecrats. Those Dixiecrats are today in the GOP. And they're fighting tooth and nail for us to get nothing. So, folks, when you sit out, when you vote the couch or whatever you want to call it, you're not hurting both. You're hurting yourself. You're not hurting the Democrats and the Republicans. You're rewarding the Republicans, but you're hurting yourselves. You're rewarding the one trying to erase and eliminate us and our history and rights. And we are then preventing the party that's most aligned with what we're trying to do for the last 75 years from being able to do anything for us. So instead of sitting out, it's time that we grow up, and show out at the polls. So that brings me to something I call impact voting. Impact voting. When I first heard this thing about sitting out elections, voting the couch to get the Democrats' attention, to hurt the Democrats and force them to the negotiating table, I knew that that was a losing strategy. So I said to myself and thought and prayed about it, what is a better strategy? A better strategy is impact voting. Impact voting. What does it mean? It means voting in overwhelming numbers. So we can basically take over the Democratic Party. So we can therefore make reparations an unavoidable top-line demand that they cannot ignore by simply rewarding those who support what we're trying to get done by voting in overwhelming numbers. And that way we will also punish those who oppose reparations. You see, that's how politics works. That's how power works. We will not get reparations in 1,000 years by sitting out, by voting the couch, or even worse, voting for the anti-reparation party. That doesn't make any sense. We get reparations or whatever else we demand when we show up in big numbers. Like when we show up at the club, or when we show up at the block party, or when we show up at the basketball game. When we show up with those kinds of numbers. That's how we got the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, and so on. We forced Lyndon Johnson and the Democratic Party to give us those things. He was inclined to do it, but he told Dr. King and the other civil rights leaders, but you got to go out and make me politically. And that's when African Americans during the 60s showed up in the streets and the polling stations. They faced those vicious dogs and vicious water hoses so that they could force the political machine to give us what we demanded. That worked. It still works. Sitting out, that is disinformation. That's a ploy of white supremacists to keep us from voting so that they can what? Win. Now here's some further proof. Let's look at other groups. They actually learned how to do this from us. Groups like, for example, the Cuban Americans down in Miami, Florida. They vote in blocks. Therefore, they control that city in its politics, which then enables them to get the policies that they need and want. What about the white evangelicals? They usually turn out between 70 to 80%. And that's how they get what they want. That's how they got Roe overturned. That's how they're now able to dismantle a lot of the rights that we have basically abandoned by not voting. Then the Jewish American people, their political discipline, their money, their turnout, it guarantees, as we see, that the United States will give aid to Israel. And we get mad. Giving aid to Israel, giving aid to Ukraine, giving aid to this. That's because they show up, they lobby, they force the politicians with their votes, with their money, with their presence to make them, they make those politicians give them what they're asking for. It's not a mystery. This is the way politics work. But my people have all these voices in social media putting out all kinds of disinformation that hurts our community. Think about the NRA, the gun rights folks. They show up every election. Every election. That's why they get what they want. These folks are not the majority. But boy, they make themselves heard and felt. We don't. In 2020, we showed up. But in 2022, we disappeared. Especially black men. Now, the sisters tend to show up, at least the ones who vote. But even too many of the brothers and sisters are sitting out elections. Like 2016, 59.6% of black folks voted. That means 40% or millions of eligible black voters stayed home. How in the world are we going to demand anything when half of us stay home? And in 2024, this past November, we not only failed to do impact voting, but as I've told you many times, over 2 million of us voted for the anti-reparation, anti-black, anti-civil rights party, movement, and leader. Trump, MAGA, Project 2025. How are we going to move the political needle listening to this disinformation and doing this kind of foolishness? And we see what the result has been in the first 6 months of the Trump administration. First, we lost the House, Senate, White House. And what went down with that? Reparations. That's why I say there is no way we collectively are serious about reparations doing the stuff we're doing. Following the people many of you are following. Listening to the rhetoric that many of you are listening to. So instead of blaming the Democrats and blaming the system, we need to look at ourselves. Impact voting, voting overwhelmingly for the people who are more likely to do what we want them to do. And if they don't do it, okay, we raise up people who will. We find neighbors. I like to call them neighbors, who will do what we want them to do. We use the tools, the votes that we have. We don't sit home. If we go back to that comment again, the last 2 sentences of that comment are just asininity. I don't call it vote the couch. I call it a silent protest. When I read that, that to me sounds like a bot. But I'm using it to make a point. Now, it may be a real person. But this person is not doing critical thinking if this is a person. Because he didn't protest. That's not what he did. He gave Trump, MAGA, Project 2025, and all those other white supremacists who are in Congress right now, he gave them the power to block our progress, to kill reparations, to put more right-wing judges on federal benches. And I could go on and on and on and on. That's not protest, that's surrender. That's passivity. We say we care about reparations, but we certainly don't act like it. Because the whole thinking, the whole notion that sitting out an election will punish Democrats is a joke. Because what we really need to do is show up in overwhelming numbers to punish the Republicans. That's who needs to get punished. Because as I showed you, they have opposed reparations and every other civil rights, pro-black initiative since the country's founding, because the GOP now, again, consists of those same Dixiecrats or their descendants who fought to keep us in slavery, Jim Crow, and so on. They're the ones who block reparations. If their ancestors enslaved us, why do you think the Dixiecrats who now make up the GOP will turn around and support reparations? Makes no sense. So again, I'll say it. Say it again. We got to grow up. We got to show up. And we got to show out at the polls. Otherwise, we need to shut up about reparations because we're not serious. Just think about it. These other groups, man, they turn out in high numbers. They have PACs. They form PACs. They have think tanks. They have voter scorecards. They score the politicians who vote positively for their initiatives and disperse that information. Those are the kinds of things that we need to do. They don't sit out elections, and they don't have people in their ranks telling them, don't vote for this one or don't vote. We're the only ones who are being told, don't vote. If we were serious about this, at least 85% of us would be voting every election. It definitely would not be 59.6%, 61%. No way. 80 to 85% of us would be voting, and that's overwhelming there. And that then would enable us to control the Democratic Party and its agenda. And it would also get the attention of the GOP. They would stop opposing everything we did. But we give away our power. I mean, we could dominate federal, local, and state elections. Then we'd be feared. Yeah, these politicians wouldn't take us for a joke. They wouldn't be putting this disinformation in our community. So I call this video exactly what it should be called. Blacks are not serious about reparations, because if we did, we'd show up with impact and we'd force the issue so that we couldn't be ignored. So listen, if we're serious about reparations, let's prove it. 26 midterms are coming. We got to vote like we're serious. We got to organize like we're serious. We got to demand it like we're serious. And we see that we can do this, right? We see this already. I over the Juneteenth weekend, I saw just huge crowds of African-American people celebrating Juneteenth all over the country. That is a beautiful thing. And if we can do that to have a good time, we can do that to have a powerful time by voting and organizing, strategizing, registering people to vote. We can do this. We can do this. Or we just need to stop pretending that we really care about reparations. All right, I am Reverend and Civil Rights Attorney Augustus Corbett. Thank you for watching this video, and remember, always, always, don't let anyone put you to sleep. Instead, stay woke